For the theme of the panel, this panel is what would real democracy look like? You want me to put down further? Okay. What would real democracy look like? I thought that it might be useful to talk about a concept that has been thrown around a lot, mainly as a label, and that is democratic socialism. So you're all aware that that is the mantle in which Bernie Sanders has wrapped himself, refers to himself as a democratic socialist, and so to ask a question, what does that mean? So I want to talk a little bit about that and then depart from what I think Sanders represents to take democratic socialism a little bit more seriously. And this is not a critique of Bernie at all. It's trying to show Bernie's trying to fit into contemporary politics, and he would probably agree with everything I'm saying. Anyhow, 2006, Bernie Sanders was asked, what do you mean by democratic socialism? What does a democratic socialist believe in? And this is what he said. He said, I think it means the government has got to play a very important role in making sure that it's a right of citizenship, all the people have health care, that it's a right all of our kids, regardless of income, have quality child care, are able to go to college without going deeply into debt, and it means we will do not allow large corporations and moneyed interests to destroy our environment. We create a government in which it is not dominated by big money interests. I mean, to me, it means democracy, frankly. Now, as many commentators have pointed out, that's not exactly how most people would define democratic socialism. That what Bernie Sanders offers is probably better characterized as sort of a very liberal New Deal vision. And again, there's nothing wrong with that at all. In European terms, he often compares himself to the kind of vision that has great prominence in Denmark, to some degree in Canada, other parts of Europe. And it's probably a better label, if we're looking for labels, and I'm not really interested in labels per se, is to think of him as a social democrat. So what would be the difference between a social democrat and a democratic socialist? Well, I'd have a key theme here, and again, it's not to parse. The primary interest of a social democrat like Bernie Sanders is just read, is to limit the size and influence of big business in our political system, in our state-oriented political system. That means a role of moneyed interests in electoral campaigns, in lobbying of the legislatures, and influence within government to try and put restraints and to provide counterbalancing powers. Secondly, to increase the economic welfare of citizens as consumers, which is to say to promote better wages, better incomes, better, more stable supply of jobs, free or low-cost education, reduced costs and wider access to health care, child care, parental leave policies, to redistribute money through changing revenue base and tax and so forth, and especially to cut the top tax breaks and to reduce tax burdens on ordinary people. But it's primarily dealing with people as consumers of goods and services. And then finally, you should recognize that historically in both social democratic politics and democratic socialism, sustainability historically has not been a primary theme, although it has increasingly been woven its way into those two orientations. That sustainability is an issue that Sanders has sometimes been criticized as a little weak on. Again, my point is not to really talk about Bernie Sanders, but to make a point. What would be the difference between that vision of social democracy and democratic socialism? Well, there's one simple difference, is that democratic socialism begins from the premise that democracy needs to be expanded not just at the level of the state, in the public realm of politics, but at work. Democracy has to involve us as workers, imagining ourselves as producers in society, at the point of work and around issues of worker interests and worker rights. That's the core premise of democratic socialism, at least as I understand the tradition. And again, I don't think that Bernie Sanders would disagree with that too much. It's just that he's speaking to a contemporary society where thinking about workers as rights-bearing members and thinking about workplace as a site of democracy has long been squeezed out by our dominant economic, political, and legal establishments. It's worthwhile to think back 100 years ago when you look at really the cutting edge or the vanguard of democratic progressive politics in this country. It was really focused on workers' interests, workers' rights, workers' organizations, and the organization of work. There's a reason for that. Classical political theorists have always said if you want people to be democratic citizens in the public realm, they also have to be involved in democratic-like activities in the rest of their life. After all, most of us spend most of our waking hours working. At work, looking for jobs, dealing in workplaces, and so forth. And in a kind of long-standing understanding of democracy is if you're not participating in democracy in most of your life, how are you then going to shift into a democratic mode when you go into the so-called public political realm? That just being a democratic citizen a couple times a year in the voting booth is a pretty anemic idea about what democracy is all about. To prepare people to be citizens, so they can learn the skills and the commitments and develop themselves as citizens has to take place in those other spheres of life. And again, most of us spend most of our time at work. So that a real political revolution is not just about changing our electoral laws and our tax policies, it's about changing the structure and organization of work. It is bringing democracy more and more into workplaces. Again, if you think back 100 years ago, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we identify that with school desegregation and anti-discrimination, but in its origins, the first quarter of a century, there were two primary commitments to the NAACP. One was trying to limit violence against blacks in the American South, state violence and lynching. But the other major commitment was helping blacks in the post-Reconstruction era find good work, develop greater stature as workers, organize as workers, increase their rights as workers who could compete with and could take good jobs just like white workers. And many of the early NAACP leaders allied with Socialist Party or with well-known socialists or declared themselves to be socialists. Same thing at ACLU. We think of civil liberties. Well, the ACLU began an alliance with socialists fighting for workers' rights. Only over the course of the 20th century did it shift its focus from rights of workers and workplace issues to civil liberties defined as rights of consumers, rights of consumers in a whole sphere of society. There's a whole great book just written recently by Leanne Wheeler. So that was the brilliance of the ACLU, was to appeal to a society of consumers. And increasingly, that's what our politics has been. That's true of labor unions. Labor unions began in the early 20th century and into the 30s was really thinking about bringing rights and empowerment to workers at the workplace, but increasingly, many unions shifted to a consumer-oriented strategy, just getting more wages and better benefits, and not really fighting for democracy at the workplace or democracy where workers are participants in all aspects of their lives. And that's through the history of the 20th century, with the rise of mass consumer society, with the techniques of mass advertising, with the emphasis on promising over and over again that happiness is about private wealth, not about participating as democratic citizens of society. We see the erosion of this linkage between democratization and the workplace and people's interest in standing as producers and rights at work. So in many ways, it's not surprising when we think about what social democracy looks like today, we think about it in this more consumer-oriented kind of view. But what I want to make a point about it is we see in recent years a resurgence of focusing democratic politics around workers, worker rights, worker interests, the workplace, the organization of work. There's nothing wrong with focusing on consumer issues because we all want a good income, we all want health care and so forth, but there's been an increasing resurgence of the role of workers, both as an end of politics, that if people don't experience freedom of collective participation in their communities, at their workplaces, where they spend most of their hours, that the promise of democracy is something of an illusion or a sham, but also is a means. If you're going to organize to really counterbalance the power of big business, you need to have organization at the grassroots level. And organizing people of workers, again, in recent years, has clearly become a matter of interest and a matter of great activism. Living in Seattle, we've seen an extraordinary resurgence of worker politics in recent years. We've seen an extraordinary amount of activism around hotel and restaurant workers, fast food workers, healthcare workers, farm workers, retail workers. Seattle and SeaTac, which are, of course, the cradle of the $15 minimum wage that now is spreading around the country. If you want to see what democracy looks like, the coalition of struggle that took place, we have a website called the SeaTac Seattle Minimum Wage History Project with about 70 interviews with people who participated in those struggles, all telling their stories about how it happened and all giving testimony to what democracy looks like in practice, democracy by workers and for workers. But all kinds of issues around sick pay, family leave, parental leave, re-entry for prisoners, and so forth. And it's not just low-wage workers. There has been lots of activism, graduate workers at the University of Washington. Faculty, there is a campaign going on that many of you know about to try and unionize faculty. It's a curious thing, as I tell my colleagues all the time. Many of us teach about democracy and celebrate the virtues and promises of democracy, but we don't even bother to make it locally very serious or very important part of our lives. We're willing to put up with a managed university in which we do not have a great deal of voice and which couldn't be called democratic in most terms. And so we see this. We see new coalitions developing on workplace and worker issues. Coalitions of white, black, and brown people, citizens and immigrants, males and females, straight, gay, lesbian, transgender, and increasingly linking workplace issues of jobs, work, organization of work to questions of sustainability. So, and that's what this conference is really about, is reconnecting with that progressive politics of a long time ago and bringing it back into a new kind of catalytic force within society. It involves lots of policies, and you're hearing about a lot of those policies here. I won't go down a laundry list, but it's not just about policy. It's about taking democracy seriously in our everyday lives, at and around our places of work, trying to think about how we can reconstruct the forms of organization, the structures of leadership, and the forms of accountability that organize our lives. And that's what this whole teaching's really about. It's about just don't support political democracy, but democracy in action in all aspects of life, and especially in the social spheres of work. That's what democratic socialism always yearned for, was bringing democracy into the social world of work. And that's the key, is don't just promote democracy, but try and enact democracy in your work lives as producers. Thanks.